Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Joshua Douglas, who's a professor of law at the University of Kentucky College of Law, who teaches and researches election law and voting rights, civil procedure, constitutional law, and judicial decision-making. He's the author of Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting, and he has an article at CNN, The Attacks on the 2024 Election Are Already Underway. Welcome to Background Briefing, Joshua Douglas.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And your article at CNN, The Attack on the 2024 Elections Are Already Underway. You say that if Donald Trump steals the election in 2024, as he tried to do in 2020, it will likely be because he and his supporters are laying the groundwork right now. They are infecting key government institutions that can be exploited to thwart the will of the voters. And the Supreme Court is the first major concern. So let's start with that. Why do you feel the Supreme Court is the biggest problem, given the massive and comprehensive multi-layered voter suppression, gerrymandering, intimidation of poll workers, and changing and having Republican legislatures count and certify the vote, and if they don't like it, they'll change it?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I meant to say the Supreme Court is the biggest problem. It's the first major one because it infects all of the other issues, as you just mentioned, with respect to gerrymandering, with respect to protection of the right to vote. And unfortunately, what we saw from the court in a lot of litigation in the lead up to the 2020 election is that it's not going to protect voters, that states are given really wide leeway to run their elections as they see fit. And so that opens the door to a lot of the other shenanigans that you mentioned. In addition, in 2019, the court basically wiped its hands clean of considering partisan gerrymandering claims. And so, again, states are given so much leeway to essentially rig the process to keep the current party in power. And so these things are all reinforcing each other. And I mentioned the Supreme Court first in that piece because we might think that the court would be the protector of individual rights, right? People think of the right to vote as a fundamental right, but unfortunately, the court over the past several years has not treated the right to vote in that way and has not protected voters. Instead, it's protected states.
And by the way, there is no constitutional right to vote, is there?
Well, it's not explicitly in the U.S. Constitution, but, in the 1960s, the court protected the right to vote through the federal Equal Protection Clause, and that's still good case law. So the court has chipped away at that in the treatment of voting rights and the way in which it's deferred to states. But I don't think that the argument is that because the U.S. Constitution doesn't explicitly confer the right to vote, it doesn't exist. It's that it's not being protected robustly enough as it should be under that theory of the right to vote as the most foundational, fundamental right of our democracy.
So the bottom line is that the court basically is not that interested or doesn't prioritize the plight of voters, people lining up for hours and hours, and we've seen it happen, and it's going to be obviously worse in 2022 and 2024. They are resting on states' rights, and of course that goes back to the fact that the 13 colonies, that was the first thing they insisted on before joining the Union, was that they would be able to conduct their own elections.
Yeah, and it's more than just resting on states' rights, though, because we see a real mismatch. A voter brings a lawsuit saying this law is going to harm me or is harming me, and the court says, well, you didn't bring enough evidence. You need to show a lot of evidence of the harms of a voting law. But then when the court says, okay, under our jurisprudence, states have to justify their laws, states don't have to bring any evidence whatsoever. So states now can say, well, we're concerned about voter fraud, or we're concerned about the integrity of our election system. And the court credits that without any evidence whatsoever. So there's a real mismatch in terms of what a voter has to allege and prove to seek any redress and get protection of the right to vote, versus the state can just say, well, we want to run our election, in a way that's fraud-free, which of course everyone does, and no evidence about actual fraudulent problems occurring or even likely to occur are needed to justify the state's law. And that's really the message. The court once again gutted a portion of the Voting Rights Act this past July in the Brnovich case out of Arizona, and that was one of the big messages. This theory of voter fraud can justify all sorts of state regulations.
And Alito did mention voter fraud, and it's obviously a centerpiece now with Trump's Stop the Steal campaign, and it's entirely based on lies with no factual basis, but it's metastasizing into our politics. And a recent poll indicates that something like 68% of Republicans believe that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president, which, of course, does not help his ability to govern.
And it makes it such that an election is never over because the losers will never accept defeat. And the Supreme Court is one aspect of that because they're allowing this theory of voter fraud, which doesn't exist, but this concern of it to allow states to justify ever more restrictive voting laws. So it's a cycle, and all of these things reinforce each other.
And again, I'm speaking with Joshua Douglas, a professor of law at the University of Kentucky College of Law, who teaches and researches election law and voting rights, civil procedure, constitutional law, and judicial decision-making. He's the author of Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. And he has an article at CNN, The Attacks on the 2024 Election Are Already Underway. But we already have evidence going back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was gutted by the Chief Justice, John Roberts. And he more or less argued, we've moved on, right? Well, we haven't moved on, have we? It's just obvious that the minute that pre-clearance went out the window, all these southern states and other states that were listed before having to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws, they had a whole bunch of laws ready to go, right, to hit the ground running.
Yeah, I mean, the day that Shelby County case came down in 2013, states like Texas immediately announced they were moving forward with, a voter ID law, which a court had found was going to have a disproportionate impact on minority voters, on a gerrymandered map, which the courts had already said was going to harm the representation of minority voters. So, and we also see the effects of that Shelby County case really at the local level, where you have local election officials making changes that make it harder for some people to vote that previously would have been stopped by that pre-clearance regime of the Voting Rights Act.
So you mentioned in your article, Joshua Douglas, that in 2019 the federal courthouse doors were closed to claims of unlawful partisan gerrymandering by the Supreme Court. I recall that was pretty much a unanimous decision. I mean, we're talking about partisanship, or at least the appearance of partisanship on the part of the Chief Justice and the Republican majority. But why did so many of the so-called moderates go along with that decision?
Well, so that we may be talking about a different case. So the case I'm referring to in 2019 is the Rucho versus Common Cause case out of partially there was two cases that were consolidated, one out of North Carolina and the other out of Maryland. And Justice Kagan wrote a very vigorous dissent and basically said that, of course, the courthouse doors should be open to claims of partisan gerrymandering, and here are all the problems of partisan gerrymandering. And she also made a really good point that, the solution can't be to vote the bums out if you don't like the maps they're drawing. The whole point of the maps is to make it harder to vote them out. So, when it came, I think there was a preliminary ruling out of a case in Wisconsin, which basically said that the way the plaintiffs had crafted their claim wasn't exactly precise. But when it came to the actual substantive question of can the federal courts police partisan gerrymandering, you had a very clear ideological split on the court.
So what was it, the 5-4?
I think that was the 5-4 decision in 2019, yeah,
right.
With Kagan writing for the four so-called liberals in dissent.
Okay, well, I'm glad you corrected me on that. Your article, though, talks about, you mentioned Wisconsin. There, apparently, the Republicans in Wisconsin are considering a brazen move to disband the partisan state election commission. And how will they get away with that? I mean, there's a Democratic governor there. Could he veto it?
Yeah, he could. This gets to another pillar of the attacks on our democracy, where partisan legislatures are trying to take over power from local election officials and others because basically they didn't go along with the big lie that argues that Trump actually won the election. In Wisconsin, this board was just created a few years ago, in an attempt arguably to be bipartisan. And now there's arguments that the commissioner should be subjected to prosecution for their rule, the rules they set out for the 2020 election. It's incredible. This is often been now referred to as election subversion, an attempt to subvert the will of the voters by putting into power people who don't have fidelity to democracy. They have fidelity to a particular candidate. Now, their argument on the law is that the U.S. Constitution gives state legislatures the authority to regulate elections. And so the Wisconsin state legislature could take back the authority to run elections and disband this commission, this state-level election commission, based on the authority granted by the U.S. Constitution to regulate the manner of elections. The governor could veto it, but they may argue that the Constitution says legislature and only legislature.
Well, but isn't it pretty clear, just to sort of widen out or pull back and look at this picture of comprehensive, multi-layered voter suppression underway by the Republicans? I mean, there have been a number of important articles like yours. As the Washington Post had a piece yesterday on the activities at the election board levels, where people are being normally independent, neutral people are being intimidated and quitting their jobs, and these partisan Republicans are taking their jobs. And in the state of Colorado, the Republicans are busy on social media trying to recruit people who are believers in the Stop the Steal to become election officials. So it's all happening before our eyes, and I'm frankly astounded why the Democrats in the Senate and the House don't have their hair on fire, because this is existential. You're not going to win another election. We're going to become a one-party state, just like Putin's, united Russia. So,
this is something that I spoke with my election law students in today's class about. Is you had someone like Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger stand up to Trump when Trump asked him to find 11,860 votes, I think it was, that won more than the margin of Biden's win in Georgia. He said, "I'll just go find them," in a phone call in December 2020. And Raffensperger basically said no, right? He said that would subvert the will of the voters. But what if you have someone who is more loyal to Trump? And right now you have someone from the right, Representative Jody Hice, who's running in the primary against Raffensperger for that Georgia Secretary of State position. Similar thing with a local election official in Michigan, who the Republican Party has punished for certifying accurately the results of the election in that county. It's a real concern if you have people in these positions of power who have the authority to go, or not authority, but would try to go find those votes to put the candidate on top. It is an existential crisis for democracy.
Well, just in closing then, Joshua Douglas, do you think the Supreme Court justices, the conservatives, the 6-3 majority of conservatives, they must read newspapers, they must be aware that this is underway? Are they countenancing it? Because it's pretty brazen, isn't it?
I think that they believe that it's not their role to step in. They're going to only hear cases that are brought to them, and there's a argument again on this. The legislatures have the authority that at least 4 justices and maybe a 5th with John Roberts in a prior case indicated that he agreed. This is known as the independent state legislature doctrine. And so, they may just say, look, we're going to let the legislatures figure this out. Of course, the legislatures themselves are becoming less and less representative of the people through gerrymandering. So I'm nervous about holding out hope that the court would step in. But, if we have a situation where you get a true subversion of the will of the voters and there's a law, a legal hook, then we'll see what happens. I think we're in a brave new world is the ultimate answer here.
Yeah, but do these Supreme Court justices, the conservatives, want to be seen as political partisans in robes?
I think they don't want to, but I think they have been.
Right, and they're likely to be more so, right?
A lot of them are seen that way.
Right. Well, I thank you for joining us, Joshua Douglas. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much.
And I've been speaking with Joshua Douglas, who's a professor of law at the University of Kentucky College of Law, who teaches and researches election law and voting rights, civil procedure, constitutional law, and judicial decision-making. He's the author of Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting, and he has an article at CNN. The attacks on the 2024 election are already underway. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon. If you missed any of today's program or would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we also encourage you to rate and review us on those platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. To help us sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where you will find our nonprofit Public Truth Media Foundation, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now. The guy that lived next door in 305